Buenas tardes, os doy la bienvenida como director del Círculo de Bellas Artes a esta, seguro que apasionante, conversación entre José Ignacio Torreblanca y...
Well, let's get started. It's also my pleasure to be here. As Jose said, you realize now it takes 4 men to introduce you. So this is also, the worth of us, the weight of us compared to the capacity to displace intellectual power in this room today. So we are very thankful for you being here, Professor Bradford. It's been a pleasure to follow you throughout all these years, and to the extent to which it's possible to bring you and to help you also navigate Spain and get your word across, of course. And we do this in cooperation with Telefónica and Aspen, who, as you know, are the ones keeping this discussion here in Spain about technology and society live and alive. And we are mostly dealing with the external consequences and with the EU consequences and the geopolitical consequences of technology. So I think this is a great team that we have partnered up today to be here. So the way we're going to run this, because Professor Bradford has 4 events today, and she lost her voice last week, and she still has to talk tomorrow in Brussels, we're going to protect her voice a bit by having a 10-minute projection, 5-minute projection of a conversation that she held in Brussels with the FT correspondent, where she lays out some of the topics that she wants to deal with. Then she would do her introductory remarks. We will then start a conversation with a couple of questions I will put to her, and then we will want to bring you into the discussion to have a very open, frank, and candid conversation, so she can answer your questions, with the aim of finishing in quarter to 8. So we have 1 hour to do this. So let's get, maybe if you want to say hi before we get the video, because it's kind of a cold start just to get the video into, but let's have a word by you, and then we start with the video. Thank you, Professor Bradford. Thank you, Anna.
Nacho, thank you so much. And I want to thank all my generous hosts this evening and earlier today. It really has been a wonderful, wonderful day. And I mentioned earlier, Madrid is a very special place for me. This is where I finished the Brussels effect. So I was living here with my family for 6 months back in 2019. And this is the first time I am back, and it feels very, very special. So thank you for opening the conversations in Spain about the digital empires. I am sorry I am not in my 100% shape to tell the story, so we get a little bit of assist with the video, and I will pick it up from there and finish the remarks, and really want to just make sure that I have the voice through the Q&A, the part that I'm most excited about. So thank you again for having me.
Excellent. So, we know we are all against social scoring, but when it comes to becoming a Madrileña, maybe you've scored a lot of points now, so we hope you can complete that round and acquire the full category of a Madrileña very soon, especially after today, this tour de force that you're doing. So let's watch the video, and then we can start with the conversation.
You paint a picture to us. What is it about these empires and the battle that you describe in your book?
Yeah, so digital empire starts from this notion that there's increasingly a consensus around the world that technology needs to be regulated. But there is no consensus on what that regulation ought to look like. So in the book, I argue that there are 3 primary ways to think about tech regulation. There is the American market-driven model, the Chinese state-driven model, and the European, what I call a rights-driven model. And these all reflect different views on the relationship between the state, the market, and the individual. And then I call these empires because none of the 3 are really confining their regulatory models to their own market. Instead, they are all exporting it across the global marketplace. So America is exporting the private power of its tech companies that are everywhere. China is primarily exporting the infrastructure power, so building 5G networks, data centers, undersea cables, and so forth, and expanding the Chinese sphere of influence. And the Europeans are exporting the superpower that they have, which is regulation. So the European digital regulations are then finding their way across the global marketplace through this phenomenon that I have identified as the Brussels effect. So Javier, when these 3 empires are then at the same time providing a different layer to digital ecosystem. We have many markets around the world where you have American tech companies, Chinese infrastructure, and European regulations at the same time. So this is how the empires are also coming into conflict and are colliding. So we see regulatory battles between the US and the EU, and we see escalating tech war, especially between China and the United States.
From the perspective of Europe and the EU, where we are, where I sit, it seems to me, though, that the battle has been lost. I mean, there's a school of thought, people that I talk to all the time say, you know, Europe is good at regulating, but not really good at innovating. It seems to me that really the European Union is not really in the battle at all, that it lost it.
Yes, I share many of the concerns that you know, Javier. First of all, I do not believe that the EU is at the mercy of the US and China. It is not willing to choose the state-driven or the market-driven model. The Chinese model is too oppressive. The American model is too permissive for the Europeans. So the Europeans have been adamant that they are charting their own path forward, and that's why they have articulated this empire of rules. But I completely agree that the Europeans should not be content in just being the referee. They need to get on the field and play the game, play offense and defense, and play it well. So this comes to the question of European innovation. But here I would want to draw this distinction that it's not that the Europeans are behind the US and the EU because they are regulating technology. It is not the GDPR that is holding the European companies back. But sometimes I do fear that this desire for a good reason to regulate sometimes then puts aside other important pieces of the tech ecosystem that the Europeans ought to be building very decisively. So I think there's a lot to be done that would help the Europeans to become innovators. So if I can just very quickly mention a few of them. One thing, we do need to complete the digital single market. Otherwise, the European tech companies cannot scale. We do need deep, robust, integrated capital markets. That's the way you fund the innovations. We need to rethink and rewrite our bankruptcy laws that allow for European entrepreneurs to take risks, occasionally fail, and then raise money again. And finally, we do need to be committed to bringing the world's best talent to Europe. This is something that Americans have done spectacularly well at, and the Europeans still have a long way to go. So those are some of the ingredients that I think are an important part to make Europe truly a player, and that's also, to me, the path to greater technological sovereignty.
So have we been...
Okay.
Great, excellent. So thank you. That was a little assist and save my voice so that I can lay out the basic argument about three different regulatory models and the respective roles that the United States and China and the EU play. So I mentioned in the video that then when you have these digital empires contributing a different layer to digital ecosystems in different markets, they also come into conflict. So we see these collisions, and the book talks a lot about these different battles. But I distinguish between two different types of battles that I think is helpful for us when we try to make sense of the big picture. So we, at the same time, see the empires fight these horizontal battles. So the battles between the US and China, the tech war that is right now unfolding, but also various regulatory battles between the US and the EU when the EU is trying to rein in the power of US tech companies in the EU market. But at the very same time, when those horizontal battles take place, we see vertical battles whereby each government is trying to fight the tech companies within its own markets. And those two levels of battles are intertwined. Because also, if you think about that, Americans are right now considering if they ought to abandon some of their market-driven convictions and start regulating the tech companies whose power they are also increasingly uncomfortable with. That deliberation of regulation takes place in the shadow of that US-China tech war, which does introduce elements of restraint. The US is not as willing to go all the way and regulate its tech companies because it needs to preserve the very asset it has against China in the battle for technological supremacy. So that's why we see these periods of escalation alternate with periods of de-escalation at the same time when the governments remain quite conflicted on how aggressively they can pursue the tech companies in their markets. But let me now focus on the question that probably interests most of you, which is what happens in these battles? Who wins the horizontal battle and who wins the vertical battle? So who are the true digital empires? And here I make a couple of predictions. The first being that the American market-driven model is failing. And with that, the idea of this expansion of the US digital empire is really getting the kind of pushback that it leads to the erosion of that empire. So people and governments around the world are increasingly distrustful of the US tech companies and are now also lining up behind a variant of the regulatory models that restrict the power of those companies. So even the US itself, as I mentioned, is now increasingly uncomfortable with some of its techno-libertarian convictions. But if the US model is not doing well, that is good news in many ways for the European model, because many governments in the democratic world are now aligning themselves behind a variant of the European rights-driven regulatory model. So Europe is actually doing quite well when countries in, let's say, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan are looking to emulate many aspects of the European digital regulation. But I do have a few concerns about the Europe's digital empire. And one was the one that I mentioned in that talk, is the question whether it is compatible with innovation. And that is a general concern in many parts of the world, and that is what concerns the Americans when they are considering whether to replicate the EU. They ask whether that means that, yes, we may be protecting the rights the way Europeans are, but does it mean we will be like Europe when it comes to innovation? And I try to rebut that argument and lay out these alternative reasons that explain why the Europeans are behind the Americans. It's not the digital regulation that is holding European tech companies back. I am concerned about something else, though. It's not the over-regulation, but the under-regulation. I am much more concerned that the Europeans are very good at promulgating regulations, but not as good at enforcing them. So we actually have a lot of problems with implementation. And if we cannot entrench that that rights-driven model into actual concrete market outcomes, then the Europeans will win a hollow victory, and the American market-driven model reigns in practice. Then there's yet another concern, the third concern that I think is real and something that we really need to think about. Even though the Europeans are doing well in the democratic world, the rights-driven model has very few takers in the authoritarian and authoritarian-leaning world, and that part of the world is growing by the day. And we sometimes forget that. But there is a whole list of countries that are very drawn to the state-driven model. And I think that is a big challenge for Europeans and for the Americans. So there's a couple of reasons why the Chinese model appeals to them. One is this infrastructure power. The Chinese ability to provide many developing countries a path to digital development. It's very hard to ask these countries not to engage with China when China is giving them what they need and what they can afford, and Europeans and Americans are not offering an alternative. A second issue, what makes it quite hard for us to fight against the Chinese model and persuade these countries to turn away from the state-driven model. And this is something that I'm not very comfortable saying. It was one of those paragraphs when I was writing the book that I was really uncomfortable to do, but I think it had to be there. But China has shown to the world that freedom is not necessary for innovation. They have managed to create a thriving tech economy without being free. So it is very hard for us to go to many countries and say, if you choose the Chinese model, you can get control, but you will not see economic growth. They look at China and they say, it seems that I can have both. So we have an extra challenge to convince the rest of the world why the rights-driven model and why the model founded on liberal democracy is capable of delivering the kind of outcomes that they should also be striving for. So let me now end with what I think is the most important battle of all, building directly to my concerns about China. And that is the battle over the future of liberal democracy. And in the book, I remind the US and the EU and everybody else that liberal democracy can erode one of two ways. One is if the US and the EU lose the horizontal battle to China, and the world is turning increasingly digital authoritarian. And I think we cannot take our victory there for granted. But second, I think it's really important for us to remember that liberal democracy also gets eroded if the US and the EU lose their vertical battle to the tech companies. And we are ultimately governed not by our democratic governments, but those big platforms. And that is also the battle that we are not necessarily winning. And here my concern is twofold again. The US has a really hard time legislating. There's nothing really coming out of US Congress on tech regulation. The Chinese government doesn't have a hard time legislating. The Europeans, as I mentioned, we can legislate, but the Europeans have a hard time enforcing. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't have a hard time enforcing. They decide it's time to crack down on big tech, they will crack down on the big tech. So if that happens, and we cannot show that while being committed to rule of law and democracy, we can also deliver, we can also find a way to hold the big tech accountable, we are forced to conclude that the digital economy is governed either by authoritarians, whereby democratic governments are destined to fail in that same endeavor, or our digital economy is governed by tech companies, and neither is consistent with the principles of digital economy. And ultimately, that's the warning of the book. That's the call to action. That is the question I want to leave the people to think about, is that are the true digital empires ultimately the authoritarians or the tech companies? Or is there a way that we can show that liberal democracies can provide the foundation for human engagement and our digital economy? So let me maybe end it there.
Thank you. Great. Let's get the conversation started with around the room. I wanted to first ask you why and how, if true, generative AI changed or changes everything. It seemed that EU was on a path to regulating more or less kind of everything related with technology in different regulations and acts and so on. But then this funny chat box which helps secondary school children to write and to fake their essays kind of changed everything, right? That all of a sudden we have discussions which go from extinction to very small things, but which are massively damaging at the micro level, like people also faking deep, videos on pornography and so on. So I guess that this is when the discussion on AI has gone down and come to the public, to the wider public, not to those who are expert on technology. And I guess they were like rather puzzled by seeing prominent tech developers and owners of these big tech companies talking about nuclear weapons and extinction, but also massive disinformation. To which extent is this true or not? Which worries you most of this spectrum from extinction to everyday micro but massive damages? What should keep us awake at night in that spectrum which is so wide?
So, Nacho, I think it's very natural that when somebody draws the comparison to nuclear weapons, extinction, obliterating humanity, that's where probably most people would say that's why I can't sleep at night. I personally have a very hard time, and I read about this a lot, I have many conversations, but to attach any probabilities on those most extreme tail end risks. Just the fact that they are part of the public conversation, they are put out there by leading technologies, I don't think we can afford to ignore them. I don't think that we should have a policy conversation that basically just disregards that conversation. But I think we should be laser focused right now on the risks that are all but certain to materialize, and not sometime in the future, but immediately. So the issues that I'm most worried about right now is that we're already struggling to tell the difference between sort of reality and sort of the facts and fiction, and our sort of ability to process information, acquire information, verify information is already compromised, especially when that disinformation takes place in the context of political elections. And now we have these new powerful tools to amplify disinformation and fundamentally undermine democratic elections. And if you think about just next year, we have elections in about 50 countries around the world, including presidential election in the United States, European Parliament elections here. We have elections in the UK, in India, in Mexico, in Indonesia. I mean, this is very significant. And we already know that we have a massive challenge with disinformation. So if the AI makes it even harder to detect, when we have the combination of text and video and imaging and voice, and distorts those outcomes, we are eroding the very institutions that are even capable of legislating on AI and governing AI. And I think that's something that we should be very, very worried about. So I'm worried about democracy. I am worried about bias, so fundamental rights. I'm worried about privacy. So I think there are, if you look at how China, for instance, is deploying AI towards mass surveillance of populations and the capabilities that the AI will have to engage in that kind of surveillance. I think if we talk about what is at the very heart of the European rights-driven model and vision for the digital governance, that very foundation can be compromised by AI. And those are not hypothetical risks. Those are the risks that we already know, that if you have biased data set training AI systems, AI will be amplifying those biases. So I think there's just a kind of an immediate, urgent legislative agenda that we absolutely need to be deliver on. And at the same time, we can probably proceed on trying to coordinate the sort of the scientific efforts to try to also detect and verify and explore and prevent any of the longer term, including any existential risks.
Yeah, which maybe leads me very naturally into asking you about Elon Musk and implementation and enforcement. Because in the past, we did not have DSA and DMA, and just with the code of conduct and the exercises that were being carried on this information, we were getting things done. Then Elon Musk kicks in, and former Twitter X now kind of runs out of control. Already he's got 2 warnings from the European Commission in written. Their executives did not attend meetings on the Slovak elections. Yeah. So we have a big battle there in which now we have the tools, but do we have the will? Can we actually tame or bring Musk into, discipline or whatever to abide by the rules? Is it too late? And maybe this is an example of what you say in your book, that we come in late, and by now Twitter is our public space, and we cannot shut down our public space because we don't have a replacement for that. So are you worried that it's like problems like the ones we have with disinformation and Musk, and he's effectively regulating global public opinion, not the European Parliament, despite having 470 MPs signing up to DSA and DMA. And in a sense here, I think Musk is also very revealing of your vertical battles, because in the US, he's a techno-libertarian. Yeah. In China, he signs letters about harmony and competition with the Chinese government. And in Europe, he basically gets away with it. So he plays different games in different fields because he adapts to that. So, who's going to win this battle? Breton versus Musk, Europe versus X, What is your bet on that?
Yeah, so when Elon Musk finally completed his purchase of Twitter, he tweeted that now finally the bird is freed. And it took a couple of hours for Commissioner Breton to go on Twitter and basically tweet that in Europe the bird will fly by our rules. And now it is for him to show that those rules apply. There's no exception for sort of individuals like Musk, whose instinct is not to play by rules. And I think this is really important, but it is a big test case for the DSA. So the Digital Services Act gives the EU the tools to control individuals like Elon Musk. But also the DSA has entered into force at the time when we are dealing with the massively divisive disinformation around Gaza and Israel. And there's just a lot of harm that is happening in terms of both disinformation and hate speech and the kind of propaganda that you're trying to control in that space. And we don't yet have the years and years of experience of using the tool. So it is kind of a rough start with your new legislative instrument. But I think if the Europeans were to back off and concede that even with this new powerful world's leading instrument to control the way that the content is being moderated, it would be just a major setback, and the question of the EU's credibility would be called into question. The problem with Musk is that what he did, that he basically gutted his team, so he doesn't have even the manpower to do this well. He basically chose to fire the individuals that were part of his safety team. So he doesn't, even if he had the will, he currently doesn't have the capabilities of fully complying. So then comes the question, what can the EU do? So the EU can fine him, fines he's fine with. He doesn't seem to care about like money's gamble for him and entertainment and everything else. But ultimately, the EU has the ability to basically withdraw his ability to offer his services in the EU. And frankly, I'm increasingly asking the question, how detrimental would it be for any of us if X was not present in Europe? I am not sure how much welfare and social innovation and even kind of economic gain he's bringing that we can have those conversations. I think there are many people who are questioning what it does to our societal conversations and how essential of an infrastructure it is. And ultimately, I think that if he is not brought into line, he should not be able to operate in the EU.
Interesting. Okay. And then last question before we move to the audience. As the EU tries and pass its AI Act, we know this is a difficult process. We know that it's taking quite a long. We know that reaching consensus among the 27 and then the different institutions is not easy. But at the same time, we've seen different processes going in parallel, not at the same normative depth, but maybe, and this is a question of a larger impact, like Biden's executive order, Hiroshima process, and the OECD. So the EU is just now competing in a regulation which has not passed with processes that are already out there in the OECD, G7, and also Biden. So taking your lessons from the Brussels effect and what happened in the past, how and to which extent is the EU going to be able this time, with its hard regulations, be able to set the golden standard or AI, or are we going to be living and coexist with kind of different jurisdictions of varying intensity and legal value, and we will have to learn with kind of a messy patchwork of legislations on soft and hard in the West, because this is as good as we can get in order to fight or contend with the Chinese model?
So I think we are going to see some inevitable fragmentation. There's not going to be a global consensus on how we would regulate AI. So the Chinese have been very active. They have passed already a set of more narrow but still binding regulation on AI. So AI is an interesting thing for the Chinese. So it's very powerful for their political goals because AI can be a tool for mass surveillance. So China is adamant in developing AI. But generative AI can undermine the state control because it can undermine the censorship regime. So you cannot in China let these generative AI models run free because otherwise you lose control of the public space. And the government it will not allow that to happen. So China has actually been very adamant at regulating. But there are many ways that the China deploys AI that you would directly look at what China does and compare that to the list that the EU is planning on banning in its AI Act. So when it comes to social scoring, when it comes to mass surveillance, when it comes to the kind of manipulation that is possible under the Chinese model, there's no way that I can see that bridge to ever be somehow those two positions to be reconciled. So there's going to be differences. And I thought it was helpful that the UK convened a summit, that at least there's a global conversation, even if we are nowhere near to having any global AI treaty. At least we are having a better understanding of where the countries are coming from. And we are creating a momentum for governments to go back to their own jurisdictions and engage in that vertical battle and say, look, everybody's doing this now. We need to regulate AI. That is, even the US now has come up with a 100+ page executive order tasking over 25 agencies with various domains on how AI needs to be controlled. So everybody seems to be on board that something needs to be done. So this momentum is giving, I think, also political support for the EU to finalize its own legislative process. It is not fighting against the world where everybody is leading with pro-innovation and the EU would be the only one trying to control the risks associated with the AI. The world is, by and large, on the same page. Whether the EU can then use its AI Act as a global model and generate a variant of the Brussels effect, I think that remains to be seen. First of all, the EU is now not helping by having its own internal divisions that are all but close to derailing the AI Act. So if we lose the momentum now and don't get this done, I hope we can still get this done during the Spanish presidency before the end of the year, or then it would regardless need to be done early next year because it cannot go past the parliamentary elections in the summer. Otherwise, we are back into the drawing board and losing very valuable time. So the Europeans need to, first of all, finish this. But if and when, I hope they will do, I think this will be by far the most significant legislation out there. Because unlike the Chinese law that is already out there, this is comprehensive horizontal law, not piece-by-piece regulation. And it is not an authoritarian regulation. It is a template for the democratic world that I think will be very informative. It is, I think, more powerful than the executive order because the executive order still mainly calls for standards, guidelines, voluntary practices, studies, dedicated resources. So it doesn't do much with really controlling high-risk AI, not to mention prohibiting some AI application. It is binding law, it's hard law, and it is the law that will affect any US AI company that wants to do business in the EU. So I think it can have a significant global effect. And let me just give you one example why I think the Brussels effect will at least in some instances take place. So normally these AI models are better the more data you use to train them. So the companies don't want to throw data away. They want to have all the possible data that they can have to perfect their models. So if you want to use any European data to train your model, you need to make sure that that data management is consistent with the European AI Act. If you then want to offer that same AI system that you have trained that works in the EU, outside of the EU, and then also make sure that it would evade those burdensome European regulations, you would need to retrain your models. And I think you don't want to retrain your models for different markets. You want to use global data. You want to offer them globally. And in that sense, there is an incentive for the scale reasons to also use them global models. So to some extent, we can expect the European models to potentially generate the Brussels effect. But it's very interesting and important that Europe is also part of any global efforts to achieve, whether it's going to be not a binding AI treaty, but some international convergence on some principles that we all can agree on.
Amazing. So let's open the conversation and let's gather questions from the room. I think there's a mic over there. I see one question, two, there, three. So let's take this. If you want these three questions, you have, in case you do it in Spanish, you have a translator there. Just let's make sure that the channel is right. Or okay. Okay, go ahead. No, you have the mic, please. No problem. The mic is over there already.
Thank you. I will try in English, so I hope my English is good. I come from the public administration, and I am CEO of tax and economy in Madrid municipality, and we are quite worried about generative AI because meanwhile we are building a future regulation. The technology is on our hand now, 20 euros per month, OpenAI in the new version, with great capabilities of working. And I have two questions. Question number one is, we have created a society with a proof of truth based on audiovisual and image and videos. I mean, a judge or a court, many times they just judge a criminal act because of image on audiovisual content. Now this is nonsense with the capabilities of artificial intelligence. So my question is, how are we going to manage and to make the professionals of the justice aware of this problem? This is the question number one. And question number two is simpler. I mean, when you are working for a mayor or a minister and you have to make a press note in high at night, and you are just embarrassed and stressed, you can take OpenAI to give a hand to you. These models, large language models, are based on public information with a lot of problems. They are fine-tuned by the enterprises. Big enterprises are offering us to public administration AI technology, but they are fine-tuned, and we don't know what the ethics of this fine-tuning are. So is there any chance to regulate some ethic in that fine-tuning processing? Because we are absolutely blind of what the enterprises are offering to us. Because we know technology is very, very powerful, but we don't know what the processes of fine-tuning are in those platforms. I mean, this is very fast and very powerful, and they are offering to us, and it's very attractive offer. So we are a little bit, distorted and desorientados in English. So thank you. I hope my English is quite good enough. Thank you very much.
So let me take the second question first. So not only might you find it difficult to know what the ethics of the model is, how the model performs, when you are then applying it so you haven't developed the model, you take somebody's model and then you are deploying the model. This other worry is that there are arguments that suggest that if something goes wrong with the model, you are responsible and not the ones who developed the model. So we haven't even fully resolved whether we could still hold the initial developer liable or just the way you use the model. Then comes the question that, are you in a position to understand the model well enough, because you didn't develop it, that you can actually make sure that when you use it in public administration, let's now imagine that you'll be working on social security and you're using AI to allocate social security benefits. Then there's actually a bias in the model. That means that some families are adversely affected, or some ethnicities are adversely affected, or women don't have the same benefits. And the question is, maybe you didn't know whether that bias was already built into the initial model. And then the question is, who is going to be responsible? So there's a lot of question of how do we handle this longer supply chain? And I think there's going to be a lot of work for lawyers to think about the contractual arrangement that when you acquire that technology, how much do you know, what information needs to be passed on to you about the parameters of the model, and then who is responsible to make sure that the data is unbiased and the data management is consistent, and so forth. So I think that's one question, is that what can you expect from the developers of the model in order then to make sure it serves your needs and doesn't cause harm. One, what I think we will be seeing is that you will be developing your bespoke models in the public administration, that there's kind of very basic foundation model, but then you will train it with your data sets. So basically you have the basic technology, but then there are data scientists who basically help you so that you will have the unique data that you have access to, that nobody else will be having the same kind of data, and it would very directly serve the population that you are serving. So I think that will become, then you have more ownership because it's your data, and then it probably makes more sense that you also have greater responsibility for that. But it's very important how we think about the relationship between the initial developer and then the one who is deploying the model. And I think it's often, like you say, if you have like OpenAI or any of these control that are funded by these big tech giants, develop the models, they have a lot of resources to take precautions. And the question is, often when we go down the supply chains, we encounter smaller players with fewer resources and fewer technical know-how. So I think that's something that I am particularly worried about, whether it's further than entrenching the power of the big tech companies if we relieve them of any responsibility. And then as to your first question, just to make sure that I understood it correctly, are you worried about the sort of understanding in the judiciary or enforcement agencies of the technology itself to regulate it effectively? So here, I think it is a really legitimate concern in many ways that this is hard to regulate. It is a moving target and it's a fast developing target, and we fully don't know all the implications. And then we somehow expect that our lawmakers, our regulators are capable of regulating it. And I often hear this as an argument that, okay, we shouldn't regulate. First of all, we don't understand the technology, so let's sit back and see how the technology evolves. We are not going to be finished with AI revolution next year. So it's not that then we know enough and we can continue, we can start regulating it. AI will develop so that the lawmakers will always be to some extent behind. So we could basically always encounter the same argument that we shouldn't regulate it. I also think that our lawmakers and regulators regulate many difficult domains that they are not experts in. So our lawmakers don't know how to build planes, yet we are all comfortable with airline safety regulation. Our lawmakers don't know how to develop vaccines, or they are not sort of scientists to develop medicine, yet we all think pharmaceutical regulation is well placed and very important. So I think it is really important that we do have democratic institutions oversee and set the parameters to this technology in conversation with the developers so that we can develop them very effectively. But I think I always want to remind people that AI is not just about technology. It's also about how the technology affects democracy and fundamental rights. And that's not the expertise of the Elon Musks of the world, of the Mark Zuckerbergs in the world. They have a firm track record in showing that they should not be put in charge of our rights and democracy, which is why I think we need both governments and we need the tech companies at the table and at the main table where the decisions are being made. That needs to be democratic governments.
Great. There was a second question here, and then we move there, and then, okay, I'll see you then. Over there, and then we move.
Good night, Mrs. Bradford. Thanks for this talk, which I'm finding full of very interesting remarks and highlights. You said you were not convinced by this theory that Europe's apparent lack of appetite for innovation is caused by over-regulation. Can you elaborate a bit on what would be your hypothesis?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of things. So one is that if you look at, and I don't say regulation of everything, there's labor regulation, tax systems and everything that I think we need to look at, but digital regulation, by which I mean this opposition of the GDPR or Digital Markets Act or Digital Services Act or Data Act or AI Act, because that digital regulation would curtail innovation. So first of all, if we look at the gap between the US and the EU, it is vast. The US is doing so much better than we are when it comes to the technological, sort of creating technology companies. So if you look at the Forbes 100 leading tech companies in the world and look at the top 20, there's 3 European tech companies on that list, and one of them is Accenture, so it's questionable whether that's a tech company. One is ASML and then SAP. There are 11 US companies on that list. So it's very, if you look at like the top 100 unicorns in the world, there are 12 European companies, 7 of which are from the UK. So it is not a good showing for the EU, but this is not a new phenomena that has only started since the EU started regulating digital markets. There was very little digital regulation in the EU before 2010 when the antitrust cases, the competition cases against Google started. There was the data protection directive, but that was not very rights protective. So we fully went into a big year with the GDPR in 2016 and since 2010 when these antitrust cases started. But the years when Google was founded, Facebook were founded, 1998, 2004, there was very little digital regulation in the EU. Yet those companies were founded in the US and not in the EU. Also, the European digital regulations have very much targeted US companies, yet we're not worried about their ability to innovate. So somehow I think this idea that we are explaining the Europeans' inability to innovate at the same level to tech regulation, to me, is a misattribution. So that's why I offer these other reasons that to me are much more powerful. So one is the digital single market. It is very hard for EU tech companies to scale in the EU. We're still talking about 27 balkanized markets. So if you think about part of that is linguistic and cultural reasons. Amazon as a bookseller, it was much easier to start in the US where there's a rather uniform demand for English-speaking books. It's much harder to do that in Europe, where we read books in many different languages. The same thing if you think about the businesses of videos in demand or something like that. Consumer demand changes. Spaniards watch different movies than people in Latvia. There's not as big of a difference between Michigan and Virginia in the US. So there are some of these, but then there are also laws. There are many different legislative differences across the 27 member states, and those we ought to be removing so that the companies can scale across the entire EU. There was a study, this is a little old one, but I haven't seen a new one, in 2015, but at the time the gap was there. 4% of digital services in the EU were offered cross-border. 4%. This is not a single market. This is a very fragmented market. And if you meet you are a Spanish tech company and basically scaling within Spain, you have a very small market compared to the US or China. So that's the one big thing. Then ultimately it comes down to capital. The European tech companies are still funded by banks and not venture capital. And banks are much more risk averse. So we have some venture capital, but not at all in the same level. And we have many restrictions of who can invest in venture capitals. About 30% of the capital held in VC firms in the US is by pension funds. We have massive restrictions that pension funds cannot even invest in risky assets. So we have a very hard time getting the money to flow into the tech companies. So the tech companies in the EU can do very well in the first few funding rounds, but as soon as they need more money, they need to turn to US capital, or then they are acquired by the US tech giants. So they don't grow in the EU. And then this attitude about risk-taking. And the bankruptcy laws in the EU are often punitive. So you're not willing to try as hard, engage in these risky ventures to pursue really disruptive innovations. If you know that if you fail, you will not be able to raise fund again. In the US, it's like you fail, it's a rite of passage, then we give you more money. There's no the kind of stigma associated with failing or bankruptcy laws that make it financially so punitive. And then I made this really big point about innovators. The US is really good. They draw from the global talent. That's a massive talent pool if you have the whole world to recruit from. And the US does that. A lot of the US innovations are by foreign individuals. If you look at the over $1 billion startups in the US, over 50% of them have an immigrant founder. And if you look at even just the big tech companies, we've talked a lot about Elon Musk today. He's South African. He was born there. If you look at Jeff Bezos of Amazon, second generation Cuban. Steve Jobs of Apple, second generation Syrian. Eduardo Saverin, the co-founder of Facebook, Brazilian. Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google, Russian. This is not just an American talent story. It is the talent story that the US is able to harness the talent of the entire world, and the Europe is not. So to me, the GDPR is a side story compared to if you had a robust, deep capital markets, or you had a massive strategy to really employ the world's best talent. So that's my main issue. And I don't say all regulation is good and optimal, and EU always gets it right. I just think there is a bigger story that we need to focus on.
And it's very persuasive. Thank you.
Okay, there was a question over here, please. If the mic is here, okay, you switch it. No, we're going to have time for both. So if the mic is there, please send it over, and then, sorry about your pen. Okay? Okay.
Sí.
How can we ask parrot to say a real thing if it doesn't have a brain? At least according to the translation. So yes, I think we are very far from artificial general intelligence. We have a lot of examples of the generative AI doing very cool things. Some things, they are actually very precise. But the problem is that we don't have a full confidence that the information is correct. There's still a lot of what are known as hallucinations. So there's still a lot of information, text generated in a very credible way that actually is not correct. And I think partially is that the way if you listen to, and it's sometimes really fascinating to really look at how they train these models and how they generate the outputs, is that it is far from perfect, which is why I think we still need to distinguish the role for AI as a co-pilot, whereas we still can defend that there are many tasks where you do need human intelligence. I also think that there's a lot of human intelligence in terms of what questions are we asking? What are we trying to pursue and accomplish with AI? And that is still something that I think is for us humans to ask those questions. And ultimately, I doubt it's a long time before the agenda is set, before the prompts are generated by the generative AI. To the first part of your question, I share the concern that the Europeans are behind the US and China when it comes to one critical input for AI capabilities, which is data. So you need computing power, you need the hard power to actually develop and run those models, but you do need the data. And the Europeans have been very focused on protecting data, really sort of doubling down on that fundamental rights perspective, I think for a good reason. But we have not looked hard enough of how can we reconcile our commitment to data protection with the ability to also commercialize that data in the way that still remains consistent with the GDPR. So how can we use anonymized data in a way that does not compromise our privacy, but we can still use that extremely valuable raw data as an input into AI and other commercial purposes. And I think that's very important. And we now have some new legislative efforts to create common European data spaces, whereby that data market wouldn't be that fragmented, that we have a trusted way to transfer data. I'm not as worried about the data existing in different languages. That should be one of the easiest things for the AI to resolve, that the translation capabilities ought to become much, much better. And hopefully that will then not be an impediment and sort of one way that we can overcome these challenges. But I completely agree, and I'm happy that you raised the idea of the need to harmonize to some extent the way our data spaces work so that we can use that valuable input also towards developing AI models that serve the European society and European companies and individuals.
Now, your turn. Thank you. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Anu. I would like to ask you to elaborate on the reasons why you're so worried about the risk of under-enforcement. And I guess what I'm trying to understand is whether this is something, the enforcement gap that you describe is something specific about the digital economy and large tech companies, or something broader that has to do with the institutional design of the European Union, or a combination of both. And I guess the reason why I ask this is because there's also, as a hypothesis, the idea that the rights-based approach, being more ambitious, it always carries with it a higher risk of under-enforcement. So I'm trying to understand possible solutions. And in connection to that, just a very quick second question. I'd like to push back on the idea that sort of banning Twitter, so to speak, I know that's not what you're saying, in the European Union is really a realistic option. Do you, were you being provocative, or do you really think that this is something...
Sorry, what was that?
Banning Twitter.
The idea of sort of, prohibiting Twitter from offering, from offering its services in the European Union, whether this is really something realistic, whether it could pass sort of a basic proportionality test? Because I understand, and I think I share your view about the problems of Twitter, but I think it's also become a sort of public forum, and this would have a big weight in a sort of proportionality test. Thank you.
So let me take the under-enforcement first. And first of all, it's always a treat when you have your former student in the audience. So thank you for coming. So I think the under-enforcement is partially, it's not only relevant for digital economy, but I think the enforcement task is particularly difficult when you are dealing with the tech giants that basically have that the economic size, their economic, their political, their cultural, their societal influence is so vast. Their resources are much greater than the resources of those who are trying to control them, that it is just very difficult to do. You're also regulating a very multifaceted sort of set of tasks that these platforms engage in. And if you look at just the velocity of the information, the magnitude of that, if you think about that every minute, it's like 500 hours of YouTube video is uploaded. There's no way somebody in Berlaymont is starting to pre-screen them and deciding what is taken down. So you basically need to rely on the cooperation of the tech companies to write the algorithms that are actually doing a lot of the content moderation tasks. So you cannot do it only by the public administration. So that is already, I think, one challenge. There's just too much, too fast to control. And like we mentioned, even though these have brilliant tech individuals and resources, and they don't always want the platform certainly to cause the harms that they are causing, but they lose control of their ability, that they being the platforms. They cannot fully root out the kind of harmful speech. And it's also very difficult when you are not China, when you are democracy, and that line drawing is very hard. I think content moderation is one of the hardest. It's easier if you're authoritarian and you can just basically shut down what you don't like. But in Europe, we do believe in freedom of expression. This pays nicely to your second question too. But at the same time, we want to protect the individual's dignity and fundamental rights. We want to protect our democracy from the kind of speech that undermines that dignity and those rights and that democracy. And it's not very clear where that line is. So even if you had the best regulators with the best intent and the collaboration of these tech giants, you are going to, it's very hard to get it wrong. It's very hard to get it right, and it's very easy to get it wrong. You're going to have under-enforcement and over-enforcement, and both of them are kind of leave you wanting in terms of meeting the goals of the regulation. Then when it comes to competition law, 10 billion in fines against Google, no change in market share. So we've tried that route for over a decade, and very little has happened. The markets are not more competitive. And that's partially because of the network effects, and it's very difficult to change the behavior. But now we have new tools. The DSA and the DMA that we talked about, they are now no longer imposing just fines. They're really trying to strike to the heart of the business models. So this is a big test, whether we can actually now sort of have a different story, more successful enforcement, because we forced these companies to change the way they are actually running their businesses and how they are monetizing our data. So I think that is something that I hope that we can be more optimistic. Look, I think it's hard for me to say whether we actually ever could pull the trigger and ban X. In the US, there are these questions when they are trying to ban Twitter. There are many, and that's the land of free speech. They are much more, they are struggling even more than Europeans with that idea. And I think that could be constitutionally challenged. I think the US protections for free speech are so vast. But there's a lot of conversation that the politicians in the US cannot go politically ahead with the idea of banning Twitter because their voters like it. They would lose all the young voters if they were to ban the tool that they really like. So the question is there such a popular support that there actually would be a big public outcry if there was an X? That would be, I think, one pragmatic consideration. The second is that are there the kind of free speech laws that ultimately, even the DSA is balancing free speech with other protections? And I can imagine that platform to be used, for instance, the way we saw them being weaponized by Russian interference in the elections, that actually demonstrably changes the outcome of the election. And at that point, it's very hard for you to say that the Europeans need to put up with that we've given all the warnings. We wouldn't go straight out to banning. We've tried everything. We've tried to hold them accountable. We've tried to ask them to mitigate systemic risks, but they have failed to do so. Multiple warnings, multiple attempts, all the other remedies are exhausted, and then something that bad happens. I am not sure that ultimately you couldn't pull the trigger, but here we've talked about the scenarios. I don't think the Europeans have not gone out to the extreme remedies. We haven't broken up tech companies. It's not that you needed the DMA to do that. You actually have the powers to do that. Vestager is a one tough enforcer. She's never gone for the breakup. So that's not necessarily the European way. I don't think they are ultimately doing it, but they need to make it very clear that ultimately they are in charge. And there comes something. I actually think, if I can say one thing about Elon Musk, I think it's easier to control X. It's much harder to control Starlink, because we don't have an alternative. Elon Musk is in a position to decide if the Ukrainians can launch a drone attack in their defense against Russia, because he's in charge of the internet. Belarusian opposition leaders say, when I ask what the Europeans can do to you, no, we're just mainly negotiating with the tech companies, because otherwise our messages don't get through. They are providing the services. So these are the critical infrastructures that, even though I really hate to see that Elon Musk is calling the shots on some major geopolitical crisis, he's the only one who provides the infrastructure.
Okay, so, last question. Can we group your two questions and be fast, and then we can close in time, please? Okay, here, please, and then over there. Sí. Sí, sea breve, por favor, para que podamos cogerlo.
Thank you. My question is quite different. I think the narrative we've adopted lately is that of a zero-sum game where only one of the empires that you present is sort of the winner, and ultimately down the line, we only end up getting one of these regulating schemes. I think that's not correct, and actually we are living in a world that sort of compiles all three of them. How do we move forward with all three of them coexisting in a way that is actually much more likely?
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you both. So I share your worry about the next generation, which is why I dedicated the book to my 3 children, and basically said I realize how much their own lives consist of engaging with the world through social media and digital technologies. And I think we owe it to them to govern technology in the way that never exploits them, that protects them, and that empowers them. But I think it is really sort of hard to do. And I think all these studies show how much social media compromises their dignity and how many mental health problems there are with the addiction and with the kind of social pressures or bullying or anything else that happens. If you look at, for instance, what Instagram has done to the youth and how it has, if they detect that a teenager has an eating disorder, they can basically make that even worse by, with their targeted advertising, sending the kind of information that is actually harmful for them, but their search history shows that they are addicted to and they are consuming. And Facebook knows that. And I think that became a big scandal, which I think partially led to the ban in the Digital Services Act on targeted advertising on minors. That's a very concrete ban that the Europeans are doing. And I have said that I have a really hard time imagining that Meta Facebook can continue such practice in different parts of the world when they know that they can no longer exploit European minors. It's harder to do it in the US and say we protect the European minors, we don't care about American minors. So that's my hope that will happen. So, but there's still a lot that I think that needs to be done to protect children. If there's one thing that the two parties in the US can agree on, the few things we managed to do in the digital agenda has been to protect the privacy rights of children. It's still not sufficient, but that seems to be one way we could at least start. And I must say, though, it's also the responsibility of parents. So I say to my kids that we are using now the Chinese Communist Party rule on the game time limits. There the Communist Party sets it. Here I am using now the President Xi's doctrine at home, and they don't like that. I learned that when I was writing for the book. But I think I absolutely agree with your concern. I think otherwise we have a lost generation that is not capable of interacting, incapable of empathy, and I think we'll have a much harder chance of thriving. But thank you. And I want to now mention, I don't think necessarily, I even in the book don't believe that one empire prevails. I predict that the US is moving closer to the EU, and the Chinese is also continuing as a very strong one. So we have more of a bifurcated world where we have a sort of techno-democracies coalescing behind a variant of the EU model, not all following the same model, and then a coalition of techno-autocracies following the Chinese model. And this is going to be one of those big horizontal battles about the future of digital democracy. But I do warn that if the Europeans don't know how to enforce it, then the American model continues to be, it will have lost the ideological battle, but in practice we're still dealing with the tech companies' excessive power. So there I'm very much in agreement with you that there's possible future whereby we continue to this fight across the three empires unless we can make sure that the democratic governments can be in charge in the world of techno-democracies.
Thank you so much. You covered a lot, also in time. So we must go now. We must thank everyone for being here today. I hope they all enjoyed the conversation as I did. And I also got some insights for your work. Thanks to the organizers again, Telefónica and Aspen. Thanks to the translators as well for the work. And thank you to all for coming. It was amazing. Thank you so much. Big applause.
Thank you.